In this lecture, I'm going to discuss landscape splines. Splines are useful anytime you need to place down a long row of the same mesh in order to create features such as roads, fences, walls, etc. Without using splines, each mesh would have to be positioned individually, one by one, which would be extremely time-consuming. But with splines, you can simply define a path instead, and then each mesh will be positioned and rotated automatically to follow the path. In addition, if the terrain is uneven or the path is obstructed, landscape splines will automatically conform the terrain to the path. Okay, and because landscape splines affect the terrain, you may want to consider placing the spline in its own edit layer so that it is non-destructive. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to the Edit Layers category in Sculpt mode of the Landscape panel. And I'm going to right-click and select Create, and then rename the new layer Spline Layer. And then I'm going to right-click on the layer again, and there's this option in the menu, Reserve for Splines, that will allow me to use this layer with splines. So I'm going to select that, which will pop up a warning message letting me know that any editing I've already done on this layer will be lost, and that no future editing will be allowed other than using splines. So I'm going to click Yes to continue. And once I do so, it will automatically switch to the Splines tool in Manage mode. Alright, so now, to place the first control points of a new spline path, I simply need to hold down the Control key and then left-click. And then if I left-click again, while continuing to hold down Control, it will add a second control point, which will automatically connect to the first. It will also change the selection to the newly created point. So as long as I keep holding down Control, I can continue to left-click to quickly connect a long path. And as you can see, the terrain automatically adjusts to the path. So if the path ends up above the landscape, the terrain will be raised. If the path is below the landscape, the terrain will be lowered. And if the path goes through a landscape feature, it will be removed to allow the path to go through. Okay, so now, if I want to connect the next point to a different part of the spline, I can simply left-click on whichever control point I want, and it will select that point. So now, with this point selected, if I hold down Control and left-click, the new point will be connected to that point, and a fork will be created in the path. So this green area represents the path of the spline. And if you're wondering why parts of it appear to be invisible, that's because those are the areas where the path is currently underneath the terrain. So while the editor will attempt to conform the terrain to the path as much as possible, it can't do so perfectly, and so some manual tweaking may be necessary at certain points after the meshes are applied to the spline. Alright, so instead of using Control left click to create new control points, I can also hold down the Alt key and then left click and drag out a copy of a point which will automatically connect to the original. And if this Use Auto Rotate Control Point property is checked, when I release the mouse, the control point will be automatically rotated in a way that maintains a smooth path. Alright, so if I want to adjust the location of a control point that I've already placed, I can simply select it and then change its location or rotation just like any other actor, either by using the transformation widgets in the viewport or by editing its properties in the Details panel. And then just beneath the location and rotation properties is the half width property. This is used to set the width of the spline on either side of the control point. So when this is set to the default value of 1000, the total width of the spline at that point is 2000. So you can have your spline have different widths along its path by setting different values for individual control points. But if you want to set the width for the entire length of the spline, you can come over here in the Tool Settings category in the Landscape panel and click this Select All Control Points button, allowing you to set the half width value or any other property for every control point at once. Alright, and then if I want to create a new spline, I just need to make sure that no current spline is selected, and then once I Control left click again, it will create the first control point for a new spline. Okay, and then if I want to join two splines, I just need to select a control point on one of them, and then control left click on a control point of the other one. Alright, so while each point on a spline is called a control point, each section of the spline between two control points is called a segment. And just like anything else, segments can be selected by left clicking on them. So the first thing I want to point out is that when you select a segment, it will automatically change the transformation widget used by control points. So if you want to get back to using the translation widget for control points, you will need to click the translation widget button up here or press the shortcut key W. Okay, so while this transformation widget occupies the button slot and uses the same shortcut key as the scale widget, it is actually a different tool. This widget is used to adjust the length of the tangent at that end of the segment. This determines how curved the segment is. So you can change the length of the tangent by left-clicking on the end of it and then dragging it either longer or shorter. So you can see as I adjust the length, the curvature of that segment of the spline is changing. Okay, and if I go over to the Details panel, under the Landscape Spline Segment category, there is this property Connections. And if I expand that, there will be two indices, one for the control point at one end of the segment and one for the control point at the other end. And then expanding those will reveal the properties tangent length and socket name. So the tangent length can be set either using the widget tool or the tangent length property. So you can see, as I drag the end of the tool in the viewport, the value of the tangent length property is changing in the Details panel. Okay, and then if you want to be able to access and manipulate specific control points in blueprints, you can set a name for the control point using this socket name property. Okay, and then at the top of the Landscape Spline Segment category is this Flip Selected Segments button. This will flip the selected splines horizontally, meaning the ends of the segments will switch sides. So index 0 becomes index 1 and vice versa. And also, any meshes attached to the segment will face in the opposite direction. Alright, so next, if I wanted to split a segment in two, once I have a segment selected, I can hold Control and left click anywhere along it to do so, creating a new control point in between. Alternatively, I can select a control point and then hold down the Alt key and left click and drag on the translation widget. But instead of dragging away from the spline, by dragging towards an existing segment, once I release the mouse, it will split the segment in two at that point. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at some of the various options there are when defining the spline path, let's take a look at actually using them for their intended purpose, which is the automatic positioning of meshes. One option we have is to add meshes to the individual control points. For example, I could select this point here, and then in the Details panel, in the Mesh category, there is a Mesh property. So I could set this to the Pillar Mesh if I wished. Or let's say I wanted pillars all along this path, spaced out at regular intervals. I can select any control point or segment, and then click the Select All Control Points button again, and now when I assign the pillar to the Mesh property, it will place a pillar on every control point of the spline. Okay, so that's how you can use splines to create meshes at regular intervals, but the more common use of splines is to create a continuous row of meshes. To do that, you need to assign the mesh to the segments of the spline instead. So I'm going to reset the mesh property to its default value of none to clear out the pillar mesh from the control points. And then, this time, instead of clicking the Select All Control Points button, I'm going to click the Select All Segments button. And now, I'm going to look for the Landscape Spline Meshes category, where there will be this Spline Meshes property that can be used to add one or more meshes to the selected segments. So I'm going to click on this Add button once, and then I'm going to expand the menus, and under index 0, I'm going to set the mesh property to be the wall _ 400 by 200 mesh. And then I'm going to set this scale to width property to false. So now you can see I have this unbroken wall extending across the entire length of the spline. And each individual mesh has been perfectly positioned and rotated automatically to match the path, which would have taken an immense amount of time to achieve manually. So you can see how powerful splines are when it comes to constructing things like roads, walls, fences, and so on. Alright, so that will conclude part 1 of the lecture on landscape splines, and we will continue the discussion in the next lecture.